Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm finally getting around to doing something I meant to do like almost a year ago. Continuing on with my series of ranking every player from certain reality shows. This time, I'll be ranking every player from Australian Survivor, which, with that, I should clarify the Network 10 version. This will not be including players from Australian Survivor 2002 or 2006. Now, this will be a ranking here based on these players in the grand scheme of things, not just how they played specifically on their season, but how I feel like they would do on most given seasons. Now, this is part one of this video, where I will be splitting this into 4 parts, like I did with my Big Brother review, because I need to spread out the content on this channel, considering how far behind I am on things. For sure, this video was meant to be coming out immediately after Brains vs. Brawn 2, though obviously knowing that A vs. the World was happening, I decided to wait for that. And even after that, again, I've been behind on videos, and we had Big Brother going on, to where, again, it's been a lot going on. Finally getting around to making the video itself here, though. But still, again, this will be coming out in 4 parts. Once all 4 parts are out, I will be releasing them all in one video at the tail end. So with that, we do have 201 players to be ranking here, which, again, with me splitting this into 4 parts, actually does allow for this to be fairly equal, at least in terms of the number of players across these 4 parts, where in this video, I'll start from 201 and go to 151, and after that, each part will have 50 players each. But before getting into the ranking itself, I should give a major disclaimer here that this video will not be including the players from Australian Survivor versus the World. At least, again, the World tribe from that series, which you might question, why is this? And it's because genuinely it bothered me too, where, again, we do know that Australian Survivor versus the World, they are considering this a canon season of the show. It is officially season 11. But to that, I say, why? Where, again, it just feels like such a different season from every other series, to where, why are we making this the same thing as a season a third of the length with also almost half the cast, where, again, to me, it just did not feel right. However, to make up for that, I will be talking about each of the players from the World Tribe in this video. Just, again, I just did not feel like it was appropriate to be ranking them amongst the rest of the field when the games were so vastly different, and obviously these players have other legacies outside the show that can also taint their ranking as well. Now, with that said, I will be taking AU versus the World into account when it comes to the players that originated from Australian Survivor, which obviously will be on this list, where, again, while I don't think their placements will really factor too much into the ranking here, I do think how they played, particularly in how they maneuvered through the social strategy aspects of the game, will at least play a factor into the ranking here. Now, with that said, players like Sandra, players like Russell, that did play full Australian Survivor seasons, those players will be in the ranking here. Yeah, again, just with the World Tribe here, it just felt a bit weird to really compare the two, with them being just so vastly different in terms of the number of days played, how many pre-existing relationships factored into things, all the legacies involved, to where, again, I just felt like I was better off leaving them out of this, and again, keeping this to the players that have played full-blown Australian Survivor seasons. So let's start talking about them in boot order, starting off with Rob Bentley. And Rob Bentley is someone that, again, if we were solely taking his Australian Survivor game into account, it would not be good. I mean, he is someone that initially seemed to have a majority alliance, but then supposedly came off as very domineering, and the other players didn't really want to be around him, to where the women eventually flipped the votes on him, where, again, if I did put him on the ranking, he would not be particularly great, probably at the very bottom of the list, but again, closer to some of these like first boots that had a modicum of power, only have the entire game flip on them. And then we move on to Tony, where I think Tony would have been a very difficult player to rank here, where he really is one that I just don't find that much fault in what he was doing on this season. I think he was just kind of screwed based on the initial dynamics of the season, where, again, with that, maybe he would be like somewhere around where like Sandra ends up being on the actual list, where, again, they kind of have a similar reputation coming into the seasons, though, to be fair, I mean, Sandra made through more votes than Tony did, to where, again, maybe Tony would be lower because of that. But, again, ultimately, again, he would be someone that I would suspect to be kind of just middle of the road, just taking his Australian Survivor stint into it, where I think he was just kind of given no real chance to begin with. And then we move on to Cass. And Cass is a player that I think came off fairly well on her appearance here. I do feel like she found herself in the majority, stuck with that majority throughout the pre-merge phase, while also having some agency throughout the Tony vote, and then proceeds to get outplayed by Parvati towards the end, though, again, it's a fine game. Though, again, this is where I think, like, the ranking would have been very tricky with someone like Cassandra, someone that, like, technically only made it through, 5 votes. There are players that go to that many tribals in the pre-swap phase alone. Like, I just think it's very difficult to really rank someone like Cass amongst the rest of the field here, though. She is a very competent player, one that I think probably would have been in the upper portions of the list, where I do think she played fairly well considering her placement. And then we move on to Tommy. And Tommy's someone that would not rank as high as Cass. I think Tommy might actually be ranked even lower than Tony, where Tommy was just kind of on the bottom for a lot of the season. For a while, I do think he had some decent instincts, especially towards the end. He was just largely ineffective in what he was trying to do. Now, he at least had like the likes of Cass and Lisa wanting to keep him around, but I felt like that was more so just based on numbers, more so than like them really cultivating this great relationship with Tommy. But I would have ranked Tommy fairly low amongst like the players that did make the merge phase of the game. Like if I were to guesstimate, I would say somewhere around like the 120 range or something, where again, not quite halfway through the list, though not obviously towards the very bottom either. Next, then moving on to Lisa, and Lisa's very difficult to rank here as well, as she was really in the majority for pretty much her entire run, really up until like the Cass and Tommy vote offs. But once that happens, obviously her game just spirals. She's very ineffective in her final round, and she threatens to quit to save Tommy, but again, that doesn't really factor into too much. But still, again, it's a spot here where I think Lisa probably would be like somewhere middle of the pack. Again, at least did have an initial majority, had some influence over the Tony vote. Yeah, after that, her game kind of crumbles to where, again, she would be above Tommy, but probably middling by the end. Then we move on to Cirie. And Cirie, someone that I legitimately just would not know what to really do with here. We're really just taking her Australian Survivor resume into account. She probably would be, again, towards the top of the list, like definitely top 50, maybe top 30. I'm not really sure where exactly around that she lands, though, where again, she's someone that had win equity, though I think she was playing suboptimally, trying to get to the end of Parvati. I do think she kind of let go of a lot of the influence she had in the game to go to the end of Parvati. And again, this ends up being a very difficult player to rank amongst the rest of the Australian Survivor field, because of how influenced her game was due to pregame relationships and how she was, again, a big jury threat, but one that wouldn't be the one that she actually wanted to go to the end with in Parvati, where, again, it's just a very strange game, though, again, I do obviously think she would be towards the top of the list, but not the very, very top. And finally, we're moving on to Parvati, where straight up, part of the reason why it bothers me to include Ave vs. the World is because Parvati would be number one, and it wouldn't really be that close, to where, again, I just feel like it's kind of lame to end my ranking of every Australian Survivor player with Parvati, who hasn't even played a full-blown Australian Survivor season. But again, Parvati's game on Ave vs. the World is near flawless. It is a game where she dominates the game from beginning to end. Yes, I do think there were things that definitely helped her in that case, but I do think she plays fairly optimally for most of her run, and it is a very impressive game, a game that has very little faults. And again, that is very rare in Australian Survivor, but also kind of has to be that way because there's not much room to have faults with a game so short. If Ave vs. the World was a 50-day season, do I think Parvati's game would be as near flawless as it was? No. But again, there wasn't really opportunity to show that. And I feel like, again, that is the reason why it's so difficult for me to really assess these players in the same light. Where, again, I just feel like the game that they played was so vastly different. I actually feel like Ave vs. the World would actually be easier to compare to with players that played in New Era or players that played in Survivor US, where, again, it's a more similar sort of format. Similar amount of tribals. Yes, it's less days, but, again, not as much of a difference in terms of the number of players. But again, when it's a season that is like half the amount of people, also a third amount of the days, I just feel like it's such a radically different game to where it would not feel appropriate to me to have Parvati at number one, even though, again, that is genuinely what would have happened. If I did include Ave vs. the World, again, Parvati would have been the best Australian Survivor player of all time. But again, it's just something that doesn't sit right with me, as again, I still don't even consider her an Australian Survivor player. But with that, now let's get into the actual ranking itself. We have 201 players to be ranking here. So let's start off at number 201, the worst player in the history of Network 10's Australian Survivor is Rogue from Australian Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. And I said this at the time, and not much has really changed since then. I do think Rogue is a truly awful player, one that is probably the first boot from her tribe on most occasions, where she's not even someone that is like fundamentally screwed in the game, where again, we'll have players that we'll talk about in a little bit that I do think on most given seasons, they're probably just screwed based on archetype, based on physical strength. However, I don't feel like Rogue is even that. Rogue is somebody that, again, if she just had a different personality, she probably would be someone that would be kept around for a decent while, be in the majority alliance. But the thing is that she's so off-putting to everybody that she can't even get into that position. So when the opposing tribe is cheering at her elimination, that really just shows how much is wrong there, to where Rogue was, again, just such an awful player. is probably the first boot almost every single time she plays. It's even very difficult to even keep her around as a GOAT with how off-putting she was. Though ultimately, again, I felt like Rogue ends up being the worst player of Australian Survivor here at number 201. Now, number 200, moving on to the second worst player in Australian Survivor, someone that also was really actively bad. And to be fair to this person, I do think there's at least more of a chance that they fix their game on the return. I mean, if they ever were to return, which is not happening. But either way, at number 200, I do have Matt Dyson from Champs Contenders 1. And Matt Dyson, someone that really just blew up his game. He was in a spot where he did not need to be the first boot from his tribe. He was not lined up to be it, but then got so paranoid that he essentially made himself the first boot of his tribe and made comments that made all the women turn against him. And again, it's just a pretty astronomically bad exit from the game. It's about where he was on the bottom either way. I mean, yeah, he was rightfully worried about his in-game position, but for him to take that position and to just actively make it worse is just so bad. Again, while he is someone that is a massive fan of the show, I'm sure if he were to return, maybe he wouldn't blow up his game in the way that he did. Just based on what we do have of his game, he does really self-sabotage his game in a pretty astronomical way to where, again, I have him here at number 200. Now, number 199, we have a player that I think there's a serious argument he's worse than Matt Dyson, yet I also feel like this person was just kind of screwed from the offset, and that player is Dez from Australian Survivor 2016. And Dez is someone that obviously is never going to do well in Survivor. He's someone that is not in the greatest shape, someone that will always be looked at as his physical liability and be a potential first out because of that. Also, he is someone that didn't really get along with his tribe, didn't really bother bonding with a lot of his tribe, would obviously antagonize Kat on his way out. And again, Dez is not a good player either. Yet I just feel like in the comparison between Matt and Dez, I feel like Matt had to do so much more actively wrong to get in the position he was. Well, Dez is someone that was probably going to be in that position either way. And well, again, I think you could definitely argue which one is worse between the two. I do think Matt's more actively bad play led to Dez being, again, a tad better for me. He's here at number 199. Now, 198, we have another player from Australian Survivor 2016, another player that's pretty awful. That player is Barry. And Barry was one I actually did have a bit higher on my initial draft of this list. However, the more I think about it, the more I realize that Barry's just someone that just kind of sucks at the game of Survivor. Someone that, again, doesn't really want to play the game, refused to be in any alliances, refused to even tell anybody how he was voting. He just feels like somebody that, again, didn't even really want to be playing the game. And along with the fact that, again, he's on the older side of things. Now, again, I don't think to the point where he would be an obvious first boot right away, where, again, he was capable in challenges, yet it's just a spot where Barry's someone that just, like, actively pushes away anyone that wants to work with him and doesn't bother making relationships, and is just an easy boot because of that, to where, yeah, in comparison to the next few people we'll be talking about, at least they tried to play the game. Barry doesn't. So because I have Barry here at 198. Now, 197, we're moving on to a player that was below Barry initially, but again, at least this person tried to play the game, even though, again, they did it poorly. That person is Indy from this latest season of Brains Respawn 2. And Indy is a player here that, again, I do think there's definitely this, like, Matt Dyson aspect of her like, self-sabotaging her game. Even worse in the sense that she actually seemed to be in a okay short-term position with the women wanting to work with her, only for her to then rat them out to the men and really get both sides to target her. Again, that's really, really bad. However, I'll at least give her a tad of credit for, again, at least having the women want to work with her, and her at least having this strategic gumption in the game, to where, while obviously was bad, I do think the fact that she was at least willing to recognize that she's on the bottom and feel like she needs to do something and actually try to make a move, I think is something admirable there. And while obviously, again, terrible instincts, made the wrong move, I do think, again, in comparison to the worst that we've just talked about, at least she tried. She's here at 197. Now 196. Moving on to a player that, I mean, again, at least he was trying. We have Russell Hantz from Champs Contenders. And again, this is an assessment of Russell Hantz solely as an Australian Survivor player, not including his appearances on other shows, where if we're just simply taking his game from Australian Survivor Champs Contenders into account, it's pretty awful. Now, I will say, I do think there are some graces to be given to him in the sense that obviously he was a returning player, or a player that no one trusted from the offset and didn't want to work with, especially considering he's the only American on this tribe. There were a lot of things that were definitely working against him, though at the same time, I do think Russell actually plays it pretty poorly, where instead of like actually trying to make connections with the others, he essentially just tries to bulldoze them and taunt them with his idol. And again, I didn't really feel like that was the right approach to all this. Now, and again, with him also going out with the idol around his neck, it is a pretty disastrous outcome for him. Now, at least credit to him in the sense that he actually does come fairly close to staying. Though, to be fair, the only reason he comes anywhere close to staying is because he has the idol, where if it wasn't for the idol, he would have just been a near unanimous vote off to begin with. But again, it's a spot here where I think he played this pretty poorly. Now, again, he's higher than the people we talked about just because I do think he came in with a lot more natural disadvantages against him, but still played awfully here. He's at 196. Now 195. We're moving on to another player from the most recent season. We're moving on to Kent from Brains of Brawn 2. And Kent is someone that I, again, think there are reasons to potentially have him higher in the sense that he did survive a tribal that he was not a target at. So again, good for him. A problem is the fact that he obviously proceeded to sabotage his entire game at that tribal, where he obviously ends up exposing his entire game for no real reason, making him a big target coming into the following round. And at that point, he's just kind of an easy vote off there, where he's one of these players that, again, like, should have been fine. Like, if he did not say anything, he would have at least been fine for next round where Miles would have been a target over him. Yet instead, he just actively sabotages his own game and gets himself voted out. But again, he survived a tribal where he wasn't a target, so that's something. But again, he's there at number 195, now 194. Moving on to, I guess, a sliver better. We have Michael Warren from Heroes Villains, and really, I think Michael and Kent are like very similar players. Both voted out their second tribals, both in spots where they were not being targeted at their first tribal, and both players that kind of blew up their own games and made themselves big targets. However, I did think the slight difference, again, the slight benefit here for Michael Warren is the fact that he actually seemed to have like a level of agency early on in the game, where Kent is someone that never really even got his way. Even when Indy went home, he didn't want Indy to go home. At least Michael did want Anjali going home and did get that. So that's something. Also, to be fair to him, I do feel like he actually does less actively bad work to self-sabotage himself, or Kent just exposes his game for like no real reason. Again, Michael, to be fair, probably does it more naturally in the fact that he just like turned people off. But still, again, I think there's like, again, slivers here. Where while they're very similar players, I do think at the end of the day, I do have Michael here at number 194. At 193, going back to Brains of Brawn 2. It's almost as if Brains of Brawn 2 had a lot of bad players on it. We're moving on to Nash. And Nash is a very difficult player to assess here, as really, like, there's an argument he should be lower. I mean, he was going to be the first boot of his tribe, and it wasn't for the threat of his idol. And after that, he was just booted immediately afterwards. So again, it's pretty bad. I will say the one saving grace here for Nash and why he's as high as he is because he did have allies. Like, he did have Ursula wanting to work with him. Zen and, like, PD initially seemed to want to work with him at least. And same thing with, like, Kristen, where, again, there were at least people on his side. And he did actually technically get his target out at that first vote as well. Kind of like Michael, to where, and there's like minor things to praise him for. Again, it's still all based around the fact that he had an idol, where if it wasn't for that, he probably would have been an easy first boot. But ultimately, again, he at least got his way at that first vote. Also having, again, some people wanting to work with him. So again, that's good enough to be here at 193. Now 192, continuing on with players that were booted at their second tribal. We have Jess from Titans vs. Rebels. And Jess is a player that, again, in comparison to the people we have been talking about, I think probably does less actively wrong. I mean, yeah, she had seemed to be pretty aloof socially, didn't really get a lot of social cues, also didn't really bond with many people out there, though also was in a spot where she at least got through that first vote. Got her way through that first vote. Mind you, again, that was more so the doings of Mark and Eden, but still, again, had enough legs to get her way through that first round, and obviously does eventually get taken out in the second round, where she's just kind of aloof, not really realizing that she was just kind of used as a number the previous round, though I still think it's a spot there where she probably does less actively wrong than the people we've talked about. I mean, in comparison to, again, the likes of Nash and Michael and Kent and, like, Indy, it's like she definitely does less wrong than them, to where, again, it's still not great. I just think she is someone that kind of naturally didn't really gel with people on her tribe and was just kind of looked at as expendable, but she at least got through a vote and didn't do as much actively wrong to me. So again, she's here at 192. Now number 191. Moving on to another player booted at their second tribal after playing pretty poorly. And that player is Brianna from Blood vs. Water. And Brianna is someone that, again, isn't as disastrous as these last people we talked about, where while I do think she was gaming too hard and people didn't really want to work with her, she, again, at least had an ally in Shay. She at least did survive a tribal where she wasn't being talked about as a target, to where, again, that's something. Now, again, outside that, still came off way too aggressive to the others where she became a very easy target. But I do feel like what she does wrong is less actively bad than the last couple we talked about. And again, she did cleanly get through that first tribal, so it's enough to be her 191. Now, number 190, a player that I think there's a serious argument this person should be lower on this list. I actually think there's a lot of comparisons between this person and Rogue. However, the benefits is the fact that this person actually made it fairly deep. I do have Kelly from Titans versus Rebels, and Kelly ends up being a very difficult player to assess here because, again, I think on paper she is one of the worst players of all time. I think she is a player that is so unreliable as an ally, someone that can't even be a GOAT. You can't even drag her to the end because she's so unreliable, but also she's someone that is so disliked by the majority of her tribe, where she annoys the majority of the people around her. However, I do think, again, in comparison to Rogue, I think there is a big difference there in the sense that I think with Rogue, she just generally pisses people off. I think with Kelly, it's just kind of like a humorous kind of annoyance to it, to where I think the vibes are slightly different there. Yeah, still, I think Kelly is someone that if she were booted in one of her first few rounds, she probably actually would be like right next to Rogue. Yeah, again, she somehow made it almost to the merge. And while obviously that is still very reliant on who exactly is around her, where that was largely from the doing of Kirby, I do think the fact that she made it somewhat deep, way deeper than anyone else we've talked about so far, and deeper than most of the people we're about to be talking about, really for a while, is again enough to put her right outside the bottom 10. So good for her. She's at 190. Now at 189, we're moving on to a player that was the first boot from her season, though again also was kind of naturally always going to be so, yet I also feel like she still had a fairly poor read despite that to put her this low. And at number 189, I do have Janelle from Brains versus Brawn, who was the first boot from the Brawn tribe, which again, in itself, I do think is something to mention here. Again, the fact that she was on the Brawn tribe, it's about where she was clearly the least brawny of her tribe, to where, and that definitely is a massive disadvantage there, something that just kind of gives them an easy way to vote her out. Yeah, the thing that makes this a little bit more complex is the fact that she actually had a grouping that wanted her to stay. She had almost half the tribe actively wanting her to stay, trying to keep her in the game. The problem is that she didn't trust them and decided to instead work against them, to which she ended up trying to work with the people that actually did want her out of the game. So again, I think there are aspects of her game here that actually would place her higher, as again, she's someone that still had a decent amount of people that didn't want her to go. Yeah, I think it is really that fact, though, that proceeds to seemingly have a pretty poor read on the game and not believe the people that were actually with her. I think that's what makes me place her a bit lower than what she could have been here at number 189. At number 188, moving on to a player that I think played horribly, but a player that at least had a modicum of influence in the game, and that player is Adam from AU 2017. And Adam, again, is a player that is the first boot from his tribe, though in a spot where he did have initially a fairly big backing, where it actually did seem like he was this initial leader of his tribe, and while he does eventually lose that through, again, getting so paranoid and pushing away someone like Tara, who was this major swing vote, it obviously ends up leading to his elimination, though in a spot where, again, I do think Adam had some decent skills for the game. He was at least able to cultivate this initial majority, had a couple of those people still siding with him by the time he goes home. Though again, it is still another spot where he did really sabotage his own game, where had he not come off as so domineering and so paranoid, he probably did have a much deeper run in him, though he kind of like actively sabotaged that by the end. So again, it's bad enough to be here at number 188. And number 187, moving on to another player that should have had influence and then kind of didn't by the end. That player is Peeta from Titans vs. Rebels, where Peeta is a weird player here in the sense that she never really had a majority of her tribe, yet she obviously had a very strong faction of her tribe, where her, Sarah, Tobias, and Alex did seem like a very powerful quattro in the game that obviously, again, is a critical mistake when you're on a tribe of 12 to think that 4 is enough to really run the show, especially when you make it so blatantly open that you're a 4. Yeah, I do think there was at least, again, some strong play there in just how solidified that group seemed to be. Also, the fact that she was able to find an idol, and while she obviously doesn't play the idol and goes home with it, it's still, again, I think there's some natural skills there for the game of Survivor. The problem is that obviously, again, she kind of turned people away, made her alliances too open, and obviously did not secure the numbers of people like Kirby and Ferris well enough to where ultimately, again, it is a spot here where she is very flawed, a very disastrous downfall. Yeah, I think the minor upsides that are there are still, again, enough to put her this high on the list at 187. Now, number 186, moving on to a player that is a similar thing, though probably not as disastrous of play, yet also probably not the highs socially that Peeta had. And at number 186, I do have Bianca from 2016, and Bianca is someone that seemingly was taken out as the first boot from her tribe simply because she was the biggest threat of the people not within the core alliance, seemingly being one of the more capable players on her tribe amongst the likes of like Kylie and Peter. Yeah, just someone that ultimately didn't really get in with the majority alliance, and the guy came off too threatening to where, though, I do think there, again, is some upside there from Bianca, though it's just a spot where we'll never really see it, and she obviously just ended up being a fairly early boot, not making the right connections in the game. So again, it's enough to put her here at number 186. Number 185, we're moving on to a player that ends up being one that had like seemingly a decent amount of influence early on, though kind of ended up throwing a lot of that away and ends up being, again, a very weird player on this season. That player is Mitch from Brains of Brawn. And again, Mitch is very weird. Again, it seemed like he was the initial leader of his tribe. It seemed like he had a decent amount of people following him, though at the same time, it did feel like, again, there's a chance that that was all just kind of a facade and he was just this figurehead, while, again, the likes of Joey was really the ones running the tribe, though, again, it's a spot where he at least survives his first tribal, in a spot where, like, George is really gung-ho but wanting to get him out. Yeah, despite that, he ends up surviving that first round, only then go out in his second round, in a spot where, by that point, he kind of just got so tunnel vision on wanting George out and didn't really even realize that there were other alliances happening around him. So while ultimately he is taken out, more so just due to the fact that George has an idol and they decide to put the vote on a safer option, Mitch ends up being someone that had no reason to really be voted out in that second spot. He's someone that, again, could have easily acclimated himself into the majority alliance and then just simply didn't because he was so opposed to playing the game and make alliances and just wanted to be targeting George, and that was his only motivation in the game. Or, again, I think he's just a player here that just didn't really seem to get the game of Survivor and was so tunnel vision the game to where, again, for me, that's enough to put him here number 185. Now number 184, moving on to a player that also pretty bad. I think you could argue is a naturally worse player, but at 184, I do have Rich from Brains of Brawn 2. And Rich ends up being a player here that, again, not great in terms of how he treated people. The fact that a lot of people were just kind of annoyed with him, didn't want him in the game. Also, the fact that he was just kind of a loose cannon to where he ultimately ends up being taken out in a spot where he really should have been the swing vote. I think that's also very bad. Though also ends up being someone that was saved by a Nonalim, where he was actually supposed to be booted before the swap, though the Nonalim ended up saving him there. Where, again, there's a lot bad there for Rich. However, I do think in comparison to Mitch, who we just talked about, I think Rich at least had more allies than Mitch did, where Mitch, again, kind of threw away all of his allies, didn't want to be in this alliance, and more so just wanted to be focusing on taking out George. Rich at least had a better idea of what he should be doing. Now, again, failed at doing those things. But again, he had connections with Laura and Logan. Laura, who actually wanted to keep him in the game. He had connections with Max and Kaylin, who's someone that supposedly was like really gung-ho about wanting to work with Rich. To where, again, I think there are at least like minor upsides there to where, while I do think he is more naturally a personality that will turn people off in comparison to Mitch, I do think the fact that he at least had people that actively wanted to work with him as well is good enough to put him here at number 184. Number 183, kind of the same thing. We have Allie from Brains of Brawn 2, and Allie's a player that, for me, really the main difference maker here is really the fact that Allie was supposed to survive the round where Rich was supposed to go home, where, again, Rich gets saved by a Nonalim, and Allie gets booed the following round after that, even in a spot there where we have, like, a lot of weird shenanigans going on, though, to be fair, that was still probably a spot where Allie would have gone either way, but still, it's a position here with Allie where she at least had an initial group. She initially was with the women. They were working together pretty well, though once they fracture, she ends up kind of struggling to find footing in the game, along with the fact that she also was just kind of too vocal in the game, both in the fact that she would annoy people around her from being too bossy, but also the fact that she proceeded to tell the opposition game information that pissed off her initial alliance, to where, again, there were a lot of downsides there for Allie. I think she's naturally someone that probably doesn't do well in the game. I don't think she has the social ability to really be able to play the game particularly well, though in comparison to Rich, I think they're kind of on the same level with, again, the fact that she was supposed to survive over Rich being good enough here to leave her at number 183. Now 182, and now we're on to a new, like, kind of sub-tier of the list. Players that aren't actively bad. Players that were booted very early on, though had disadvantages there that I don't necessarily fault them too much for. But at number 182, we're starting it off with Laura. Transpresenters 2, a player that, to be fair, is kind of forgettable in the grand scheme of Survivor, though also someone that, again, I don't think does that much wrong to cause her elimination. Like, she's really in a spot where she's kind of just taken out because she's looked at as a physical liability, because she's the smallest person on her tribe. Now, I will say there's still people in that tribe that, again, weren't really much better. I mean, you had people like Sarah Ailes, you had people like Hannah, who definitely could have been looked at as that weakness as well, where it doesn't, like, fully excuse her problems in the game, though I do, again, think that this is a spot where I don't think Laura does that much wrong. She simply was painted on with this target for being the weakest on the tribe, and after that just wasn't really able to recover, become an easy early boot to where, yeah, I don't think she does that much wrong, but she doesn't really do much right either. So she's here at number 182. Now, number 181, moving on to similar thing, though at least was somewhat closer to staying. That player is Anastasia, also from Champs Contenders 2, a person that also was the first boot of the season. And again, this is a spot here of Anastasia where, for me, it was between her and Laura. I had them back to back, and actually, initially, I had Anastasia lower until I kind of forgot about the fact that Anastasia did almost stay, where, again, there were talks about taking out Pia, and even beyond that, again, there were people that just legitimately wanted Anastasia to stay. I mean, people like Luke and Janine, where ultimately, again, it didn't really amount to much. I do feel like it's still a spot here where there at least are more upsides for Anastasia in comparison to Laura, who, again, didn't really have many people really backing her and was just kind of a consensus easy boot, where again, I think there's at least enough there from Anastasia to make her a tad better here. So again, for me, she's here at number 181. Now, number 180, another first boot, and one that was disadvantaged from the beginning, that also comes somewhat close to staying, kind of. We have Joan from AU 2017, and again, Joan's someone that almost stays in the sense that she had a tie initially during her vote off. Now, were what's ever there to really keep her? Not really, but again, there was at least a tie. So again, she had people that wanted her to stay. She also had, again, people like Luke that just wanted to cause chaos for whatever reason. Or again, was there any real chance that she was actually going to stay by the end? Not really, but I do think, again, it came close. She had numbers at least. The fact that people were even willing to cause a tie in this situation, I think, is impressive as well. Where, again, it's still not great. Though I do think, again, Jones is someone that didn't even do that much actively wrong. She was just looked at as a physical liability. And again, I think all those things kind of amount to her being good enough to be higher than the last few people we talked about. Number 180. Now 179, pretty much the same thing, though didn't come as close to staying, but at least survived the vote. And that person is Damien from Champs Contenders 1. And Damien's someone that, from a personality standpoint, like most people seem to like no one seemed to dislike Damien. Obviously looked at him as like this hero figure, though obviously despite that, he was looked at as a physical liability. Obviously his injuries causing him to lag behind in challenges, to where, again, it is a spot where Damien is higher here just because, again, people wanted to keep him. They just felt like they couldn't. Now, I think a major knock against Damien is the fact that he also did not seem to know what show he was on and didn't really care about the game of Survivor, wasn't really playing actively, was the only person not in the loop on the Russell vote out somehow, where, again, it's just kind of a spot here where I don't know if I have much faith in Damien to be actively playing the game yet. I do think, again, in this spot here where comparing him to, again, these first boosts that didn't do much wrong, Damien is a person that didn't do that much wrong. That was the second boot. Or again, while he didn't necessarily do much right, people liked him. And again, that's enough to put him here at number 179. And at number 178, a similar-ish thing. And that person is Peter from AU 2016. And Peter, again, is obviously a different case, as Peter's someone that quit the game. And despite that, again, was someone that was fairly well liked. No one, actively wanted him out of the game, but obviously he ends up quitting the game. Mine he was quitting due to him being injured coming into the season. Yeah, it's still a spot here where Peter didn't really have that gusto to really play the game. Even outside that, again, he didn't really have many alliances in the game. He was not part of that core group in the game. And obviously, there are some disadvantages to that. The fact that he's the older guy on the cast. Though, again, despite that, he did make a good relationship with someone like Kylie and Bianca. Where, again, it's not like he had people actively against him, where, again, people liked him, people wanted him around, yet he just ultimately wasn't fit at that time to be playing the game. And again, it's a spot here where I didn't know what exactly to do with him, though I think leaving him off again around the same spot as someone like a Damien and these other first boots felt about right to me. So again, he's here at number 178. At number 177, moving on to a player that survived a few tribals, though also still fairly expendable to her tribe. At 177, we're moving on to Mimi. Obviously, again, yeah, she was booted third from her tribe, did make it through a couple tribals, and survived over Anjali, survived over Michael, in a spot where it did seem like she at least initially had a group around her, where she at least was working with the likes of George and potentially Shawnee and Liz. Though the thing is that she never really seemed to have any strong relationships within that, where it really felt like she was just kind of there as a number. Though even in that position, it does feel like a spot here where she did seem to come close to staying, or at least the fact that it didn't seem like she was the initial target for that round. It felt like Steve was someone that was being more so brought up as a target until things kind of switched later her on. Though it's still a spot where it seemed like she kind of just talked too much. It really opened the floor for the vote to flip against her. Though considering, again, it didn't seem like she was at least the initial target there. So again, something I'll give her like a modicum of credit for, especially considering again, she survived a few rounds before that. Though I think a big issue with Mimi is just the fact that she was so expendable in the game. People didn't really actively care about her in the game. She didn't really have any true allies to where she had no one that was really fighting for her to stay. So ultimately, again, she's here at number 177. At number 176, moving on to a player that was initially lower until I kind of realized that maybe they're not that bad, even though they are very forgettable. That player is Kate from AU 2017. Probably one of the most forgettable players in Australian Survivor history, though someone that obviously was booted second from her tribe in a spot where she was aligned with Adam, but once Adam got sniped out of the game, she just became this easy target after that. Now, again, obviously disadvantages towards her, and the fact that she is, again, an older woman that is looked at as a physical liability, though even with that, she actually wasn't the primary target, where it really was a spot here where the majority didn't really seem to care that much between Tessa and Kate, and ultimately allowed like Tarzan to break the tie. And again, it's a spot here where she didn't have as good a relation with Tarzan, but I mean, I guess it shows her having some ability to keep the votes off her, as the majority not seeming to have that much of a vested interest here. Though ultimately, again, it's not like Kate's particularly good. I mean, at the end of the day, again, she's still this low on the list. Yeah. Again, I don't think she was as actively bad, where I would think she was really mostly sunk by the poor play of Adam and that kind of putting her into a bad spot to begin with. So again, ultimately, enough to be here number 176. Number 175, moving back to a first boot of a season, the one that was a little bit screwed over, and that player is Anjali from AU Here's Villains. And Anjali's a bit of a weird player because, again, there definitely is the argument that she was screwed over, where she was close to George and Jackie, both of which were out of the game by the time of the first tribal, obviously both getting injured, and George getting a sick day, and Jackie proceeding to actually get medevac from the game, to where ultimately Anjali, someone that, again, like lost all of her allies due to that situation, was in a fairly unlucky situation because of all that. But with that said, she did technically have a way to stop her elimination, where she could have fought back against the notion of having to vote, as they didn't even need to vote at that tribal, though instead she pushed for it despite her being the target, to where obviously that is pretty bad. Now, again, ultimately, now really though, I still think she is someone that was, again, pretty screwed over. Again, she was not going to be the first boot. It did feel like Jackie was someone that's more primed to be booted over her. So again, I do think she's still screwed to a degree, though she's, again, another person in this like kind of archetype that is not particularly poised well early on in Survivor, and didn't really seem to have the connections outside that to get the vote to go in a different direction, to where she seemed to be pretty misguided on where she actually was in the game. So ultimately, again, all of that leads to her being here number 175. Now 174, and now we're kind of moving on to a few kind of social pariahs in the game, people that maybe made it a little bit further, but people didn't really want to work with. And at number 174, we're starting it off with Ursula from Brains vs. Brawn 2, and I think Ursula on most given seasons you would assume would just be in the majority. She's someone that is very fit for challenges, someone that seems to be mostly affable, where outside of her conflicts with Noonan, she didn't really seem to be that bad socially. The problem is that, one, it seemed like Ursula didn't really do much socially early on, where again, we see the women complaining about how she didn't really talk to them until she was already on the bottom. But beyond that, she also just was on the bottom for most of the season, where again, she almost goes home with that first tribal. Mind you, again, that would have been because of Nash, more so than things that she actively did wrong. But again, she gets associated with Nash, and then once Nash eventually goes, she's still primed to be the next to go, until she gets a miraculous swap, putting her in a pretty decent position, only for her to still not really make the most of that, where she should have been able to flip over and really get accepted by the other side. Yet she really doesn't, and instead ends up being booted over Noonan, who had way more connections on the other side. And to be fair, that was also a reason to keep Noonan around. But still, it definitely felt like a spot here where she really did not make the most of the opportunity after the swap. Though, again, I think at the end of the day, you see like more potential here of Ursula than a lot of the players we've talked about so far, where I think in more given seasons, she probably finds herself in the majority. Though, again, the fact that she didn't in this season is actually generally a pretty big negative here. But ultimately, I'm going to land her here at 174. Now, 173, moving on to another kind of social pariah in the game. We're moving on to Benjamin Law from AU Here's Villains. And Ben's a player here that, again, was just on the bottom for most of the season, where I think he's just someone that didn't really seem to naturally gel in there with, again, the more bro-y crowd, where again, he was just kind of someone that was on the bottom from the offset. And despite, again, surviving some tribals, he is someone that also like needed an idol at a point, have likely been booted had it not been for Nana Lim, and someone that, again, never really had any traction in the game, where another one that after a swap, he really should have been able to flip over to the other side and really better his position in the game, only for, again, him to just kind of throw away the opportunity and stick with the people that he was on the bottom of, to where it's kind of a frustrating game in that light, where, again, it did feel like Ben had some potential in the game, but then really didn't make the most of those opportunities. And really the big difference here for me between him and Ursula is really the fact that, again, we heard more about Ursula, like not really reaching out, which is what led to her being on the bottom, where we don't really have as much to necessarily fault Ben for being on the bottom. Yeah, it's a spot where, like, once he was on the bottom, he did not play particularly well. So again, he's here at number 173. Number 172, moving on to a player that I think this player probably has a lot of potential on the return. However, again, we just did not see it on his actual appearance, and that player is Evan from AU 2016. And Evan's a player that I actually do think showed a lot of skill for the game, where he clearly was a super fan and knew what he should be doing. And again, I think he made attempts to be doing those things. The problem is that, again, he never really gelled well with his tribe. He never was really included in the Lee, L, Rowan, Phoebe alliance. And once he started to plant some seeds against Rowan, obviously just leads to him kind of blowing up his spot. Though, again, I think that's, again, a position where I do get what he's doing. I do think he actually did some pretty good work into building this bond with Lee, where Lee does actively want him to stay and does end up voting alongside him by the end. I think he's someone with a better tribe makeup, could actually make it fairly deep into the game. But again, AU 2016, especially the tribe that he started on, was not a particularly great one for him. But again, I do still have to land him here at number 172. Now, number 171, essentially same thing, but someone that made it a bit further, but also someone that probably did more actively wrong. That person is Kat from AU 2016. Now, again, in comparison to Evan, she survives over Evan. Like, she's actually able to get the people that were her ins in the alliance, and likes of Phoebe and Elle, that actually keep her around. So that's a positive. Now, negative is the fact that she plays pretty horribly from that point forward, where she ends up being in this big vendetta against Rowan, and by the time the swap, she really ends up essentially sacrificing her entire game to get Rowan out. Now, again, to be fair to her, Rowan was targeting her too, which is, again, an idiotic move from Rowan as well. But I do think it's still a spot where I am going to criticize Kat as well. And considering the rest of her game's not particularly great either, again, it leaves her being fairly low on this list here, despite actually making, again, pretty deep into the pre-merge phase, where, again, she makes it to the swap, survives over, again, a lot of the people that are higher on the list. Yeah, I do think her play towards the back portion of her game is just so actively bad. There was some decent play early on, especially in the connections she was able to build. Ultimately, again, it's a fairly lackluster game. Puts her here at number 171. Now, number 170. We're moving back to a first boot. One that some people might think should be lower. Yeah, I ultimately felt like this person had a lot of potential in the game. Didn't do as much actively wrong to sabotage that. And at number 170, I do have Frankie from AU Titans vs. Rebels. And for me, initially, my gut was her being close to PETA. I felt like they were somewhat similar, though ultimately, when I thought about it more, I do feel like Frankie actually had a lot more potential in the game. Like, unlike PETA, I do feel like Frankie did a lot less to, like, actually burn those around her. I feel like actually really was more so Nathan that was doing more of the actively poor play from their side of things. And beyond that, she seemed to have better connections than PETA did, where she actually did seem to have some pretty strong bonds with the likes of Viola and Valeria, which is really what expedited the move happening on her quicker, as they wanted to get rid of her so that they couldn't get any closer. Now, again, there's still faults to be had. Obviously, the fact that she, again, made it too open what her core group was, the fact that her and Nathan were looked at as such a clear duo, and again, I still think there's more fault to be had on Nathan for this. Yeah, considering it ends up landing on Frankie, it's still poor play here. Though, again, I think the people we've talked about so far, most of them do more things that are more actively bad than Frankie. So, again, I have her here number 170. Now 169, who would have guessed that? A person I just mentioned, we have Nathan from Titans vs. Rebels. And again, essentially the same thing, but worse in terms of how he navigated through the game, where obviously I think there's a lot more fault here on Nathan for putting this target on Frankie. But at the same time, he does survive a tribal after Frankie goes, where, again, we see him surviving over Jess. Now, how much of that was due to physical strength? Probably a lot of it, but still, I felt like Nathan at least had, again, this ability in the game to stay in the game for a bit longer. Obviously, the vote ended up being on Frankie instead of him initially, too, which, again, how much that also was due to perception of physical strength. But again, I think it's a spot here where, yeah, Nathan is a pretty bad player, and probably a more actively bad player than Frankie, though, again, him surviving a decent chunk more than her, and again, not being the target over her, again, is enough to put him here at number 169. Now 168, we're moving on to another player that had influence early on and kind of blew that up. And we're moving on to Sophie from Blood vs. Water. And Sophie actually probably is a slightly different case in the fact that obviously Sophie at least kept that power enough to lead an actual vote, where again she did lead that what was supposed to be David vote. Yeah, obviously with the idol involved, that ended up leading to Kate getting voted out. And again, Sophie seemed to be a major influence during that portion of the game. Now beyond that, again, she also has the same issues as again the likes of Nathan and Frankie, and making it too obvious what her core group is. Has this big flip in the game against her. Also really rubbing people off the wrong way, where really if it wasn't for the fact that she at least got one vote off out before her game crumbles, I do think there's actually an argument that Frankie's a better player than Sophie. Yeah, I do think the fact that Sophie, again, at least got that one round where she got something through is at least something to credit her for, even though really from that point on, her game's just kind of a disaster. She's obviously blindsided, gets saved by an on the limb, but even in that position, ends up playing the game very vindictively and just further turns people away, and ultimately leads to her just being a very easy consensus boot the next time she's at Tribal, where, again, it's a spot where I don't think she plays particularly well once she loses power, though I think the fact that she at least had power initially is something to give her credit for here. So again, here number 168. Now 167, moving on to a player that didn't do as much actively wrong, yet ultimately still was in a similar spot where she seemingly had power initially, or at least was in the majority alliance, and then proceeded to have the game completely flip on her, and that player is Susie from Champions vs. Contenders. And Susie's a player that, again, I don't think she does that much actively in the game, realistically. Again, she's really just someone that kind of just went along with her majority group, though she at least had a majority group where she had the Athletes Alliance that seemed to be running the show initially, and did lead that first vote in taking out Anastasia, to where, again, that's something to credit her for. Now, really outside that, again, obviously that group ends up flipping instantly, and she's just kind of an easy person to take out, which again, definitely physical liability and like perception-based things happening there. Yeah, I do think it's still a spot here where I don't think Susie does that much actively wrong to cause her elimination. It's really just a spot where she seemed to be looked at as the most expendable of the people in her alliance. Yeah, it's still a spot where, again, she had a majority initially backing her. I don't think there's that much actively poor play from her, to where I don't think Susie is someone that is really that bad in the grand scheme of things for being in a boot as early as she is, but and considering she is still booted as early as she is, and didn't really seem to have much gusto in the game. Ultimately, again, I'm going to land her here at number 167. Now 166, essentially Susie, but one spot better, we have Nova. And Nova literally is just Susie, but made it one more round. Now, I actually think there's a bit more of a difference in the sense that I do think actually Nova is probably more actively bad in the game, where again, she seemed to be pretty confrontational and people found her bossy. And again, that's definitely something to criticize here in comparison to Susie. It's still a spot where their trajectories are fairly similar. Nova is just the next person out after Susie goes. They kept Matt Pagongin going, and again, while I do think Nova probably does more actively wrong than Susie, I do think Nova also is someone that probably just more active than Susie. We see Nova doing a lot more game talks than Susie does, where ultimately, again, for me, it feels like a pretty minuscule difference between the two, but I'm going to go with Nova a spot higher here at 166. Now 165, and this ends up being a very difficult player to rank here, as they've technically played twice, even though they barely did. But also, there's not really that much to work with this player either. But at number 165, I'm going to go with Jackie. Obviously, originally from Champions vs. Contenders 1, and then later appeared in Heroes vs. Villains briefly. And Jackie's someone that I actually assumed was going to be higher on my initial list, where initially when thinking it through, I do think Jackie's someone that, at least on her first appearance, felt like a player that definitely had skills for the game, but it didn't really gel for initial tribe. Where obviously she was someone that was on the original Champions tribe, and with her being a poker player, not really like athletic, it didn't really lead to her really fitting in with that group. Yeah, she did find some numbers there. She had a good relationship with like Brian Lake. She had a good connection with Monica. And again, she really was someone that was primed to be taken out fairly soon. Yeah, it did feel like she at least had some potential in that game. Only obviously be eventually taken out after swap, and she got swapped with the numbers, which isn't great. But either way, she comes back, and I remember when seeing her come back for Heroes vs. Villains, I was actually kind of excited to see how she played that time around, considering, again, she was a big fan of the show. Like on podcast, she's able to talk about the game in a fairly articulate way. Yeah, she's in a spot there where obviously she gets medevac right away, and again, just from that, you wouldn't think too much against her, but the reality is that she also seemed like someone that was probably going to be booed first anyway, where it felt like she was actually someone that was the primary target in her tribe, and again, they were going to kind of take a shot at her, to take a shot at George, which again, had that played out and her been the first boot there, again, it would be a pretty disastrous track record for her, where it's tough to really put her too much higher here, where, I mean, even in comparison to Nova and Susie, who we just talked about, even Sophie, like they at least had power at points in the game. Jackie's never had power. In her 2 runs on Survivor, where she's always been this outcast early on and likely to be an early boot. Now, again, the reason I do have her this high is because, again, I do think she actually demonstrates some potential for the game in her first appearance, and she definitely had, like, some connections in the game, just not enough to really control the votes. Yeah, again, it's still a spot here where we never see that potential really realized. And again, I think there's actually arguments that she should be lower on this list, closer to where Kat and Evan are. Yeah, again, I still like to think there's a sliver of potential there. And also, too fair, we never really got to see her Heroes vs. Villains game play out. So while I think it is likely she's the first boot, we don't fully know that would have played out that way. So again, at the end of the day, I do have it here, number 165. Number 164, moving on to someone that initially was higher on my list until I kind of realized, like, why do I have this person higher on this list? Outside the fact that she kind of made it relatively deep, but again, not deeper than some of the people we already talked about. So at 164, I do have Sarah Ailes from AU 2019. And Sarah was there. Or genuinely, I don't think there's that much to really say about Sarah. I mean, she made it fairly deep into the season, all things considered. I mean, she survived a few rounds. Surprisingly, was not voted out over Laura, which I think that's probably the biggest boon to her, the fact that she somehow survived that vote and was actually never brought up as a target during that vote. But then following that, gets swapped over, is then in the majority after the swap, but then gets flipped on and then proceeds to be just an easy target after that. Again, there's not really much to really say about her, to where you can't even really say that she was swap screwed entirely, considering she was, again, swapped with majority of her numbers. Now, you could say she was screwed based on who she was exactly swapped with. Yeah, it really just feels like someone like Sarah was just kind of expendable no matter what in the game. It felt like, yeah, she had connections to someone like a Hannah and like to an Andy to a degree, but I didn't really feel like anyone, again, really cared about Sarah in the game. And also, she wasn't like a particularly active player either, to where there's not too much to praise from her outside of, again, making it fairly deep. So I have her at 164. Now, number 163, we're moving on to a player that I actually initially had lower on the list, but I feel like the fact that they were out of the game and also had some disadvantages coming in definitely boosts her a bit. At 163, I do have Kate from AU Blood vs. Water, Andy's sister. That I actually think Kate is someone that has a modicum of potential in the game. Now, again, she is a big fan of the show and clearly has some basic game knowledge, though, again, wasn't really able to demonstrate any of that because she was just kind of on the outs from the very beginning. And I think there's a couple things that factor in here. First, the fact that, again, she's on the older side of things, and because that she doesn't really gel in instantly with her group. Also, the fact that she was Andy's sister, someone that no one really looked at as trustworthy, and once he goes, she's kind of became an easy person to take out as well, to not piss off anyone on the other side, and there were a lot of things working against her in this position. But even in that position, she needed to be idled out of the game, where she almost stays during that round, where obviously if David had not played the idol, she would have survived. And if she survived, I think she had some legs in the game. Well, again, not really, because it's Blood vs. Water and it was dominated by the broy guys. I do think it's still a spot where she would have had some similar-minded players alongside her that would have been willing to make the move, as we literally see the next trial that they go to and taking a shot against like Sophie. And yeah, I think that probably still would have happened, where who knows how Kate goes on that season, where ultimately, again, I don't fault her too much for her elimination. I don't think she does that much like actively wrong. I think it really was a lot of perception based things, and even then it had an idol in play, to where ultimately, I don't know if Kate necessarily does well in most given seasons. I feel like the potential is there enough to put her here at number 163. Now number 162, and now we're moving on to a player that I think is pretty bad. I actually had this person way lower on the list, but I kind of realized, well, one, they were also out of the game, and also, again, they at least had some people wanting them to stay, and that person is Sharni Vinson, my winner pick from Heroes vs. Villains, which is funny. But she's someone that, again, was frustrating in the sense that I don't know how into the game she was. She wasn't someone that seemed to be particularly into making alliances, though she did at least have some, again, pretty core relationships out there, again, particularly with Jerry. And even in a spot where she goes home, again, she's not the primary target. Ben was, but then Ben plays the idol, where I think there's enough grace here to be given to Sharni, considering she wasn't the primary target, and she at least had some connections in the game, where, again, in comparison to someone like Kate, she makes it further than Kate. She also had more ground to stand on than Kate, who, again, as much as I do think Kate got kind of screwed over, it was still a spot where a lot of her game is more so just talking about the potential of what could have happened, where, again, we did see Sharni at least have some connection. So, again, it's good enough to put her here number 162. Number 161, a truly awful player, yet someone that gets bumped up a bit because he got taken out due to very weird circumstances, and that player is Tobias from Tiny Toons Rebels. And again, Tobias sucks, and someone that didn't really gel off some of his tribe mates, particularly Kelly. Also would, again, make loser signs at the opposing tribe whenever they won, which is just a dumb thing to do. But really, I was like, again, he had a core group. I mean, he was with Alex and Sarah. And again, credit to him, the fact that he was able to somehow avoid being a primary target, which I generally don't know how he did that, but again, he somehow was not being targeted over Alex. So it's still a spot where, again, I think he played pretty horribly socially. And I think there are a lot of commonalities between him and Nathan and Frankie, though the reason why he's higher on the list is because he gets voted out in a very weird circumstance where he essentially accidentally goes out, where, again, the intention was to take out Alex, but the way they split the vote led to Kelly being a swing vote, and Kelly switched her vote last second because it's Kelly, to where, again, it is a very weird circumstance there, where obviously, again, you could still fault him for burning his relationship with Kelly, to where she, for some reason, thought Alex was a better ally for her, even though Alex also was burning her relationship with Kelly. But still, it's still a spot where, again, I think Tobias, yeah, you could definitely give him some credit for the weird way that he ends up going out of the game, but I still think he's a pretty awful player. But again, because of the wonkiness, it's putting him here at number 161. Now at number 160, we're moving on. The final first boots of this list, both back-to-back, both being taken out in very weird circumstances, but we're starting it off at number 160 with Phil from Brains vs. Brawn. And I did debate this a bit because I do think Phil is someone that definitely had a lot of potential in the game. Phil is someone that is also a big fan of the show and had a connection to Haley, to where had they made it further into the game, I do think Phil could have had a fairly deep run in them. The problem is that Phil was at least initially seeming to be on the bottom of their group either way, where obviously they get taken out in a vote, mind you, a very wonky vote, but again, they still get taken out in the first vote of the season. Now, again, one that didn't allow for them to prepare, and one that was sprung on them last second, but it was still a vote where a majority of the group that was voting did vote them out. And I think that's a spot where it is a bit tough with Phil here, because, as again, I do think there are worlds where they're the first boot, or at least initially on the outs on a lot of seasons, because they don't really fit in. Though I do think there is, again, that potential Phil to where, though again, they're obviously this high, because again, it was still a very wonky situation to be part of, definitely them being screwed over by a twist. And again, realistically, I kind of wanted to put Phil higher just because I do have faith in Phil to be a much better player on the return. Yeah, I just felt like with the info that we currently have, it felt weird to really put them in a spot where they're higher than some people that had majority groups or had like really solid alliances, when Phil really didn't seem to have that. For a while, socially affable, and again, was building a connection with Haley, didn't really have this like core group around them. So again, ultimately for me, I did leave Phil here at number 160. Now 159, the top first boot of this list, or at least one that wasn't a returning player, and that player is Candy from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And Candy's a player here that, another one, like, doesn't seem like that bad of a player. Seems like a fully capable player, but one that just got painted with this brush of being a physical liability from the very beginning, and coming from the Brawn tribe. Again, having Nash like instantly target her, which, to be fair, some of that's her fault in the sense that she didn't talk to Nash, but still, I do think, again, there were some perception-based things playing a major factor here with Candy. With that, again, she was not really the target for the majority of the tribe. Again, she had a majority alliance around her. They were trying to keep her safe, but again, they had to split the votes because Nash found an idol, and then eventually split got messed up to lead to Candy going home. Now, I do think there is some criticism here in the fact that the reason the split got ruined was because of Candy not having a relationship with Morgan, and Morgan supposedly like pulling Kate over to flip the vote against her, which again is definitely something to criticize there. Though I think with Candy, again, it's a spot where she at least had an actual alliance around her, had a majority of the tribe backing her. Had it not been for Nash's idol, she probably does survive this round, has a decent amount of allies, where in comparison to someone like Phil, I just don't think we fully know where they were going to land in the game, even following that round, where I feel like Candy had a decent landing spot that just got unlucky with how the idol played out, to where ultimately, again, I'm going to put her above Phil at 159. Now number 158, and now we're moving on to people that had pretty big alliances backing them. The first one here is still a person that was still in the minority, but at 158, we do have Gavin from Brains vs. Brawn. And Gavin's someone that I don't think is a pretty good player. I mean, he's literally somebody that the only time he voted correctly is when he accidentally voted the wrong person, where again, obviously that is something to definitely criticize. Yeah, I think Gavin's someone that, again, seems like a fully affable guy, someone that had an alliance, was in a minority, but again, had 5 people on his side. Even then, like someone like Big D was kind of in the middle of all that. And again, it's a spot where I think Gavin, like on most given seasons, probably makes it fairly deep, though was someone that was kind of a casualty of this like big battle going on, where you had these like 2 warring factions of Simon versus Shannon, and the Shannon side had the numbers, and Gavin was someone that was just like a safer option to take out in that position. Especially, I don't think Gavin does that much actively wrong to put the target onto him, at least. So obviously, I did consider putting him like somewhat close to the likes of Susie and Nova. However, I think someone like Gavin is probably more acclimated for the game of Australian Survivor, probably makes it deeper on more given appearances. I think he just got fairly unlucky with how this specific vote played out and how they went for a safe vote, to where, again, I don't think he does much actively wrong to cause his elimination outside just being in the minority group, though obviously that alone is enough to put him this low at number 158. Now 157, now starting a group of people that were in initial majorities, though eventually lost that. At 157, we're continuing on with the Athlete Alliance from Chance Centers 2. We do have Stephen Bradbury. And Stephen, someone that, again, I also debated, again, putting him closer to Nova. However, I think there's a difference here in the fact that Stephen obviously was this main orchestrator of this alliance. We see Stephen doing a lot more of the active work to put this alliance together. And the fact that he was able to form the initial majority alliance of his tribe, I think is something to be commended here. Now, obviously, beyond that, he wasn't able to really keep this group together, and he gets flipped on after the Anastasia vote. And even after the Anastasia vote, he's kept around for a little bit longer. Even in spots where, again, he is kind of a social pariah, where he does end up burning his relationship with the likes of Abby. It does lead to him being on the bottom from that point forward. Yeah, he is someone that at least plays the game fairly hard. He is someone that built that initial alliance. So again, I put him here at number 157. Now 156, moving on to a player that he is probably more in line with someone like a Gavin over Steven. Yeah, again, he survived over Steven, so I put him here. And that player is E.T. from AU 2019. And E.T.'s a player here that kind of just found himself on the wrong side of the numbers and eventually got taken out because his tribe went to tribal over and over again. It was a spot where E.T. doesn't even seem like that bad of a player. Now, again, another one that I don't think he's particularly good strategically. He doesn't seem to be a particularly active player in the game, though is someone that is pretty well liked by the majority of his tribe. People didn't want to vote him out. They just felt like they kind of had to at that specific point, where it was between him and Simon Black. And people are literally sobbing as they're voting him out, to where I think there clearly is some good social ability from E.T. He's just, again, not a particularly active player, to where once he found himself in the Athlete Alliance, he didn't really do much with that, where obviously once that gets flipped on, he's really just on the bottom and is unable to really get himself out of that position. Though, again, I still think he's fairly unlucky to go to as many tribals as he ends up going to, where he does survive a fair share of them before eventually going out. And again, it had an alliance initially backing him, though, again, once he lost that, he wasn't really able to recover. So, again, kind of a mixed bag of a game, but I put him here at number 156. Number 154, moving on to a player that, again, I think is in a similar tier to these last few people we talked about. Again, person in the majority for these first few votes until the majority flips on them. This person maintained a majority for a bit longer in the game, and that person is Amy from AU 2017. Now, again, Amy's someone that, again, was in this majority alliance alongside Lockie for the early portions of the game. Now, while not an integral number within that, she's, again, there while they take out Adam and Kate and eventually Tarzan, and eventually the vote gets flipped onto her. Though it's a spot where, again, she at least had a majority for 3 votes before that. Again, unlike the likes of Steven and E.T., who only had the majority for 1 vote, she had the majority for a bit longer. It took a bit longer for that flip to eventually occur. Again, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like Amy's a particularly great player here. She really is just like kind of a sidekick to Lockie and kind of gets taken out just once again wanting to take a shot without losing Lockie for challenges. Though, again, I think it is a position here where Amy, again, doesn't do that much like actively wrong outside just finding herself being tied to Lockie, but at least had a majority for a decent amount of votes, to where still not a particularly good player, but ultimately good enough to be here at 155. Now 154, moving on to another player that had a majority for a brief amount of time, though unlike the others had his own majority flip on him, which is not particularly good, but still. At 154, I do have Benny from AU Brains versus Brawn, and Benny is like a weird player here where, again, he had that initial majority. He was working alongside the likes of Shannon and her group. So they end up leading the vote against Janelle. They end up proceeding to then lead the vote against Gavin, only for then the vote to flip on him immediately after that, which made no real sense of why they're doing that, which is, again, kind of a good and a bad thing at the same time, where I don't feel like Benny did like that much actively wrong, like socially, to cause his elimination. Yet it does also feel pretty egregious that they did end up flipping on him in the spot that they did, especially considering like it led to a tie, and it was just such a hectic vote that really was not organized in any significant way, that makes it a pretty insane series of events that leads to his elimination here, where it really feels like a spot where he really should not have gone home. And even when he eventually does go in this spot, it is kind of just because like some of the people on his side feel forced to flip on him because the numbers weren't there once Big D ended up flipping his vote, to where, again, it's just kind of a weird circumstance there. Well, yeah, I do think aspects of his downfall are pretty bad. Like, he obviously did not have a good enough connection with Big D, and Big D was like kind of trying to play the middle a bit too much, though it's also a position where I do think he came off as too much of a liability to his alliance and not really worth fighting for, to where again, it's kind of a mixed bag of a game. But I think the fact that he at least had this majority group early on, and even then had some people in that group wanting him to stay, and the way that his elimination plays out ends up being such a wonky circumstance, to where, again, I did feel like it was good enough to put him here at number 154. Now, number 153, we're moving on to a bit of a strange player, where I know this is someone that survived a decent amount of tribals, wasn't really in danger until their actual elimination, and even there's like kind of a story behind it, but again, it seemed like a player that had some skills for the game, but didn't really have the gusto for a long term, and that player is Sarah from Heroes vs. Villains. And Sarah's a player that, again, on the show, really gets portrayed as like, she got caught playing multiple sides and got taken out because of that, which obviously, again, played a factor in things, though I do know that Sarah also was someone that kind of resigned to going home, didn't really want to be there, and that also played a factor into things, particularly in why like Simon didn't fight for her to stay. So again, it's a spot here where Sarah did survive a decent amount of tribals, was never talked about as being in danger before that, and was, again, kind of playing both sides, again, had connections with the guys, also had connections to the likes of Liz and Shawnee, though at the end of the day was still a largely expendable person, someone that just, again, no one really fully trusted, while also someone that didn't really want to be there, to where, while I do think there was, again, some skill for the game early on, she kind of just, again, kind of lost that by the end. Again, for me, it's still enough to put her here at number 153. Number 152, moving on to a player I really didn't know what to do with because we barely saw this person on the show. But 152, I have Jay Bruno. And Jay Bruno is someone that, again, was there. Now, in terms of the game, he was someone that had ties to the likes of Amy and David, though even then, like, he didn't really seem to have that much influence in the game. Like, he didn't want David to go home in the spot that he ended up using his idol, but ended up going along with it because, again, he just didn't really have much power in the game. And following that, he is in the majority when Sophie gets voted out, though I don't know how much of that is due to work he actively did, and then he proceeds to be flipped on immediately following that, where, to be fair, I mean, it did seem like Amy was the initial primary there, but they just knew that they couldn't get her out because she had an idol, to where Jay became kind of a safe vote, though it's still a spot where Jay didn't really seem to have enough connections on his tribe, where he was looked at as a largely expendable figure. He was looked at as like a trio alongside David and Amy, and that made him a bigger target as well. Ultimately, it is a bit tough to assess Jay, just because like we see very little of him on the show, yet based on the way that his game plays out, again, it's kind of in a spot where he had his group, they got some things done, and even when he goes home, he's not like the primary target, yet he ultimately still is someone that did not really build the connections he needed to stay further into the game. So again, it's still enough to put him here at 152. And now number 151, another person we saw almost nothing of on the show, and someone that was very difficult to rank because of that. At number 151, I do have Sam from Champions Presenters 2. And again, this is a player that obviously got notably no confessionals in her run, the first person to do that on Australian Survivor, and because of that, I know very little about her game. Now, I believe she supposedly was working with the Andy Harry side of things, and again, didn't have the greatest relationship with Daisy, and through that, it kind of leads to her being kind of swap screwed to a degree, where while she's technically swapped into a majority, she's swapped with the people that she's not particularly close to, or at least in a spot where those people don't have the numbers. And obviously, at the end of the day, she obviously could have pulled over David and Luke herself and gotten a majority that way, where she obviously put too much trust into working with Daisy, though I still think it's a spot here where I think that was a bit of an unfortunate circumstance of how that swap played out for her, where while I do think there are definitely criticisms to be had to her and how she handles the swap, I think she was given a fairly bad hand by who exactly she was there with. So again, it's just very difficult to rank her just because like we have very little information from her. But ultimately, I am looking at her as someone that was, again, a little bit screwed due to the swap, while also someone that had, again, a decent amount of numbers. It was a close vote when she went, and even then had numbers on the other side. So again, I think it's not an entirely bad game, and again, it's enough to be here at number 151. And there we go. I mean, that is part one of my ranking of every player in Australian Survivor. Obviously, ending on a high note of ending with Sam and Jay Bruno. But either way, again, obviously, part two will be coming up. I'll be going through the next 50 people on the list. Maybe we'll actually get to some good players. Probably not, though. But again, stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.